David Sachs, the billionaire and co-host of the All In podcast, has for years been espousing the idea that the United States and the West taunted Russia into invading Ukraine.
Russia actually is not a revisionist great power. What it wants is just security on its borders. The revisionist power actually in Europe over the past 25 years was the United States because we pushed NATO right up to Russia's borders.
And for 3 years now, he has been pushing this view virtually unchallenged on the very popular podcast he co-hosts. And so once again, the topic came up on last week's episode, and once again, nobody challenged Sachs. In fact, to David Sachs's credit, he was begging Andrew Ross Sorkin, who was filling in as moderator for Jason Calacanis. David Sachs was begging Andrew Ross Sorkin to provide a counter-argument to the points that Sachs himself was making, and Andrew Ross Sorkin declined.
But Andrew, do you disagree? Because I want to hear your disagreement.
No. I could, but I think we're gonna run out of time.
No, disagree. We need people desperately on the All In podcast to mount intelligent counter arguments to David Sachs. The greatest trick that the devil ever played was convincing you he never existed. The greatest trick the All In podcast ever played was convincing its audience that David Sachs is right about everything because they don't have powerful enough counter arguments being made on the goddamn show. So that is what we are going to do today. We are going to provide the counter argument to David Sachs' worldview. I don't entirely disagree with David Sachs, is where I've landed so far. What I disagree with is being inundated with one point of view over the last 3 years without a sufficient counter argument being mounted. So today I'm going to introduce you to Tim Snyder. He is a Yale historian, very educated on Eastern Europe, has written books on Eastern Europe and Russia and Ukraine, and we're going to hear his view, which is very different to David's. He does not believe, in fact, he believes it is a grave miscalculation to blame the West primarily, or the United States, frankly, at all, for what Putin has done and will likely continue to do. I am Carly Riley. This is Carly P. Riley's show. I am trying to understand what is happening in the world, and I don't like living in any one echo chamber. I like listening to different points of view. I form my own opinions. They remain loosely held. If you are interested in being on this journey and hearing different viewpoints and talking it through, subscribe to the channel. Comment. Would love to hear what you think. We can debate about it, or share this episode with somebody else who you think might get value out of it. I want to start with David Sachs' own evolution on this topic, which isn't to say that he has changed his mind on this topic, but he has gotten a lot more dogmatic about it. Back in February of 2022, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, well, for the second time, obviously they invaded in 2014, when they invaded Ukraine for the second time, David Sachs gave a very thoughtful reaction on the All In podcast. This is long, but I think it's really valuable. Let's watch it.
To your question of would it have made it a difference if we had taken NATO expansion off the table, say last year? I think this year is probably already too late. But I think the answer is yes, regardless of whether you believe that NATO expansion is a real issue for the Russians or whether you think that's a pretext.
Already, just want to stop. He's already creating space and acknowledging different perspectives.
Because people are in one of those two camps. In 2008, there was a NATO summit in Bucharest in which they basically proposed that Ukraine and Georgia could eventually be eligible for membership. That basically started this whole thing. The Russians at the time said, this is an absolute non-starter for us. It's a red line. No way will we allow this to happen. In Ukraine, the conversation was deferred. They had this basically pro-Russian, democratically elected president, Yanukovych, who was deposed in a coup in 2014, a coup that was supported by our State Department and probably the CIA.
Classic.
Okay. So the Russian thinking on this, if you believe it, goes that, listen, we're about to have a pro-Western ruler come into Ukraine, installed by an American-backed coup, and now we're going to lose our main naval base in the Black Sea, and it could be replaced with a NATO base. There's no way that's happening. So they moved to seize Crimea. And then after that, they started backing Russian separatists in the Donbass, and the civil war began. Okay, so that basically is what's been leading up to this. And then last year, they started getting very exercised about the possibility of this NATO proposal, which again goes all the way back to 2008, becoming formally recognized and Ukraine joining NATO. They said that, listen, and Putin gave a speech like this, if Ukraine joins NATO, because of Article 5, the next time we have a border dispute, which is all the time, right?
One thing, there have only been border disputes since 2014, since Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. So it wasn't like border disputes were happening in 2002 and this needed to be a concern, but okay.
We could end up getting drawn into a World War III with you guys. And so there is no way we're going to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. And so they basically by December had given an ultimatum to the State Department. Now, what was the response to that? Blinken came out at the critical moment and said, NATO's door is open and will remain open. Basically said, you guys can, take a hike. Now, obviously that was an extremely provocative thing, and the Russians invaded Ukraine days later. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that if you take the Russians at their word that they believe, forget about whether you think it's true or not, but if you take them at their word that the same word they've been saying since 2008, that this is a red line for them and they have a serious vital national interest there, then you should have diplomatically tried to resolve this issue. But even if you believe it was a pretext and Putin is making up this whole red line thing, and his real goal is the expansion of Mother Russia and all that kind of stuff. Or reunification. Let's say that's his real goal. It still would have been a good idea for Blinken to basically declare that we were going to take NATO expansion off the table, which is simply an affirmation of the status quo. It's not appeasement. You're not giving anything up. You're reaffirming the status quo. Why would
You're
that have been a
blocking something from happening in the future.
Right. Why would that have been a good idea? Because the polling on this showed that the Russian people, by 2-1, were in favor of basically taking this kind of military action against Ukraine to prevent NATO expansion, but they were not in favor of doing it purely for reunification.
I really like this version of David Sacks. I think he's interesting. I think he's smart. He may or may not be correct on things he's saying, but he's bringing a different perspective to the fore. And he's doing it in a way that leaves room for disagreement, that leaves room for other perspectives. The idea that NATO expansion should have been taken off the table, regardless of whether or not you think that is actually the reason that Putin invaded Ukraine or not, makes sense to me. Now, let's see what David Sacks was saying on Friday's episode of the All In podcast.
If you look at Russia's behavior, Russia actually is not a revisionist great power. What it wants is just security on its borders. The revisionist power actually in Europe over the past 25 years was the United States, because we pushed NATO right up to Russia's borders, despite the promises that were made to Gorbachev in the 90s. So we're the ones who've revised the balance of power in a way that was profoundly threatening to the Russians. And I think it would be far better from the American standpoint to just work out a security architecture for Europe with Russia that gives the Russians the security they crave on their western border and gives Europe the security it craves.
So that is a different Sacks. That, again, not just because his hair is completely transformed colors, that is a much more dogmatic way of articulating a point of view. Now, let's talk about the substance of what he just said. He just said, if you look at Russia's behavior, Russia actually is not a revisionist great power. What it wants is just security on its borders, which strikes me as a very circular logic, because what is Russia's behavior? Russia has now twice invaded Ukraine. Sacks believes that's because they just want security on its borders. So he's saying they're not revisionist, they want security. However, you could also look at that same behavior, the fact that they've invaded Ukraine twice, and go, that is the epitome of revisionism. They are literally revising borders of countries as we speak in Europe. They are revisionist. So even the argument to me falls flatter than what he walked me through 3 years ago. Either way you slice it, though, Sacks' view is clearly that the West has failed and their diplomatic failures have led us to this point. So let's listen to Tim Snyder now. He is a historian at Yale University and has his own strong opinions about this, and he, as you will see, takes a very different view.
It's very important for us as Americans to recognize that the most important things that are happening in Russia are actually happening in Russia, and that the things that Putin says about us are very rarely, and if so only distantly, connected to actual things that we do and say in our own country. That the way to understand Putin, I think, is to follow the failure of his domestic policy.
We're going to continue this, but I am intuitively drawn to this argument. Frankly, if the United States had taken NATO expansion off the table, the idea that Putin would have made up a different pretext seems very reasonable to assume to me. It may or may not have been true. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have taken NATO expansion off the table, but it does seem entirely probable to the point that Snyder is making, which is that what Putin says about the United States is only loosely connected to what the United States is actually doing. This is all Putin creating a world, as many strongmen and dictators do, to sell his public for his own ends. But let him continue to spell this out, because I think he does a good job.
Putin comes to power with the basic idea that Russia can be rigged up into some kind of rule of law state. Dictatorship of the law is the phrase that he uses. He quickly realizes that that's not the case, or at least that he's not the person to do it, and shifts gears to a different program of rule, which involves not getting rid of oligarchy, but being the top oligarch, which is a very fundamental difference. It might look the same because you're rounding up people, putting them in jail, but becoming the top oligarch, becoming the boss of bosses, turning the state into the most important mafia clan is very different than cleaning out the stables.
If you have not read the book, Red Notice by Bill Browder, stop what you're doing, put this video down, order it right now. It is such a good book, narratively, and then also in terms of giving you a sense of exactly what Tim Snyder is describing here. Bill Browder was the largest foreign investor in Russia right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He made a lot of money buying shares in companies as things were privatizing and communism had collapsed. And he also then lost a lot of money, and he battled the oligarchs in Russia as they were becoming powerful for fairness in markets. And there was this brief moment in time, which he writes about well, where he and Putin are on the same side because Putin is coming to power. He's fighting the oligarchs, which serves Bill Browder's financial interests because he needs a fairer system. And then the flip switches, right? That sounded wrong in my head. Flip switches. Putin, as Snyder describes here, suddenly is now head oligarch. He has subdued the oligarchs enough, but he hasn't actually reformed the system. And so now Putin, as an oligarch himself, is diametrically opposed with Bill Browder's interests. And now it's very dangerous for Bill. It's a really interesting narrative that is set atop the political dynamic that Tim has just described. So go buy that now. Not an ad. Hashtag.
Once Putin makes that turn, that's the important turn, because it means that there's never going to be effective domestic policy. Russians are not going to get the things you're going to get out of the rule of law, like social mobility, freedom. They're not going to get that. What they're going to have to get instead is a foreign policy of spectacle. So we, the West, are the enemy of choice for Putin. And the reason why we're the enemy of choice is that defining the West as the enemy feeds into a very long tradition in Russia, A, and B, it's also very safe because we're not actually going to do anything aggressive with respect to Russia. So the way to understand Putin's turn against the United States is not to feel guilty about American policy. It's not to imagine that we're responsible for everything, because we're not. It's not to deny him or Russians agency, because they have agency. It's to understand the failure of Putin's domestic policy and his recognition that what he needs is a kind of permanent spectacle which comes out of foreign policy, and that the Europeans and the Americans are always going to provide that.
He's basically subtweeting David Sacks in that. That is a direct counter to David Sacks' argument that this is fundamentally about the actions that the West has taken and Putin is just reacting to them as a rational strategic actor. It's so interesting. In that All-In podcast from 3 years ago that I played you a clip from earlier, Chamath Palihapitiya in real time is looking up Russia's GDP numbers and it's like, oh wow, their GDP has fallen by 35% in the last 10 years.
What's even more interesting is that Russian GDP has actually decayed 35% in the last decade. It peaked in 2013 at $2.292 trillion, all the way down to now 1.483. So I think the point is with, all of these other things that they've been having to deal with because of their foreign adventurism, you've seen a contraction of their economy already.
Which feeds Tim Snyder's point beautifully, which is look at Russia's domestic failings, Putin's personal fears and failures as the rationale for anything he does on the foreign policy front. I am not an expert on Russia. I am a wildly curious person who likes going down rabbit holes, hearing different perspectives, which I used to get on the All-In podcast, though less so now, which is why I'm doing this now, and determining what I think, though that opinion is always going to be loosely held because there's always going to be information you don't have, you don't know. It makes sense to me that Putin is using these security concerns as a pretext. However, where Tim Snyder loses me, I've watched now many interviews with him, he has what I almost see as an old school American idealist vision of foreign policy, which says we do need to export democracy abroad. We need to be giving more resources, more money to Ukraine, supporting them even more. It is imperative that Russia lose this war. Ukraine must win because the American experiment is at risk and Europe is at risk and democracy is at large. He makes these leaps without really spelling them out because it is not my sense that he really thinks Russia is going to make a play to invade a bunch more European countries. Maybe, but he's a little bit cagey when he answers those kinds of questions. And Russia has not performed particularly well in Ukraine. I don't think their showing on the battlefield has made Putin go, yeah, let's take on the rest of Europe. And so from my vantage point, I go, the policy of trying to export American democracy abroad and force the rest of the world to our way of doing things is not a foreign policy I like. And I am grateful that we've had David Sacks talking about that for 3 years plus now on the All-In podcast. I am grateful for that, even while I don't like the dogmatic person that David Sachs has become and the way in which he really does feel like a Putin apologist on this particular issue. Would love to know what you think. Please let me know below and we can explore this topic more, or if there's others you want to explore, let me know.